18 signatures trailed down the margin of the chart like a slow, indifferent avalanche. Initials, stamped names, consult notes folded into one another until the page read like a unanimous shrug. At the very center, scanned and laminated into the electronic record, 3 words sat like a splinter. Don't save me. 18 doctors had given up on her, except for the one who couldn't read those words without feeling the room tilt. Dr. Matthew Hayes saw the scan the way some people saw lightning, brief, impossible, and leaving a certain electric charge in the air. He had been filling in that week on the hospital's private wing, covering a suite that usually took in fragile, wealthy patients with complex needs. The Blackwell suite felt less like a hospital room and more like a glassed-in study. Large windows with city views, a worn leather chair with a thin throw, a small tray of chamomile tea left by a visiting friend. Evelyn Blackwell lay in the bed beneath a thin embroidered blanket, a scattering of freckles visible across the bridge of her nose, a paperback novel sagging in her lap as though she'd simply drifted away mid-page. A laminated hospital chart did not belong to a novel or a face. A chart was meant to be a map of care, dates, doses, assessments. This one had become evidence. Matthew had been a doctor long enough to recognize patterns, a string of small, odd things that when linked became a logical yet dreadful picture. Therapy notes canceled with shorthand excuses, a physiotherapy appointment logged and then overwritten with family declined, medication administrations with missing signatures or odd timestamps, a proxy form recorded late in the day, not notarized in the family home but at a trust office with a shaky description. Now a scan with impassioned handwriting. Don't save me. The scan carried more than ink. It carried the gravity of someone putting a phrase where a voice should have been. He read the consult list again. If you counted specialty consults, rounding attendings, and those who'd weighed in, the paper did indeed carry 18 clinician endorsements recommending comfort-focused measures. That number, 18, was what the headline would be if they ever let the story out the way the Blackwell family wanted it told. It was also the axis of what Matthew was about to overturn, an institutional momentum toward non-intervention that had, in his view, been assembled more by paperwork than by careful recent bedside assessment. Evelyn's eyes flickered once when he looked up from the chart. Her fingers, when Matthew reached to straighten the blanket, tightened like the closing of a fist around a bookmark. It was such a small thing, nothing a chart could easily register, but everything a clinician should notice. Her daughter-in-law, no, that was wrong. Catherine Blackwell was Evelyn's sister-in-law by some convoluted family tie that came with philanthropic boards and trust meetings.
Catherine stood to the side, immaculate in a silk blouse, a small, cold smile set like a coin. Damien Blackwell, Evelyn's son, hovered near the door, checking his phone with the quiet impatience of a man who believed time had a monetary value. Neither of them looked like people who'd lost a mother. They looked like people keeping appointments, maintaining a brand. Matthew had never wanted the paperwork to be the final word on a human life. It had been what drove him into medicine in the first place. His grandmother's hands, the way she lingered on his childhood forehead, the small rebellions against a system that moved people like pieces on a board. He became a physician to be a witness, and to act when other witnesses glossed over the parts that were hard to see. He had his badge, a steady voice, and a suspicion. That had to be enough to begin. Leela had worked here for nearly 15 years. She kept chamomile in a thermos for the elderly patients who preferred something warm and safe. She also kept, tucked in the side pocket of her scrubs, a small voice recorder, an old habit from earlier days when she'd been a community nurse and had needed to capture difficult exchange for her notes. That recorder was now in the crook of her palm like a guilty coin, and when she handed it to Matthew with a look that said she had crossed a line and wasn't sure if it was the right one, he accepted it without a question. "I couldn't leave it on the floor of my locker," she said, voice low. "I couldn't live with myself if I didn't tell someone." He had asked where it came from, and she told him, haltingly, about a night shift when an aide had come back from the room, flustered. Damien had been there late, she said. He had murmured to the aide in a tone that wasn't for the bedbound woman. "Keep her under," Leela mimicked in a whisper, then walked out. The recorder had been left on a shelf of clean linen the next day, after Leela had heard the aide humming and talking to the device, thinking it was just a personal memo. Matthew listened to the file in the quiet of an empty supply room. The sound was grainy, human. Damien's voice was impatient, clipped. There was a male laugh offhand, and then, distinct and undeniable, a line that made the back of Matthew's neck prickle. Don't rush it. The trust won't transfer until she's ready. No single line could prove intent in a court of law, and no recording was a perfect truth. People said things in corridors, but the recorder didn't exist in isolation. It would be another stitch in the growing fabric of inconsistencies. He began assembling, not because he wanted to litigate the world, but because he had a documentation reflex, an instinct to paper a trail. He printed the chart pages, he photographed timestamps on medication logs, he noted the gaps when physiotherapy progress notes had been scribbled and then left unreturned.
He made careful copies of the proxy documents and the trust materials he could access. He labeled them. Leela watched him with a mixture of hope and fear. "If we do this wrong, it'll be worse for her," she said. Matthew understood the caveat. Missteps could create legal liabilities, breach patient confidentiality, and at worst, put Evelyn at further risk. He would not be cavalier. He also couldn't ignore the smell of lemon disinfectant and chamomile that told him he was standing in a place where something had gone wrong. He called Avery Blake that evening, a lawyer he'd met years earlier at a hospital ethics seminar. Avery's practice had been mostly estate disputes and guardianship matters, cases that required a certain stubborn patience and a willingness to look at power with a skeptical eye. On the phone, under the hum of an office air handler, Matthew described what he had found, careful with his words, careful not to leak confidential data, but needing counsel. Avery listened, then asked him to email the chart scans and the recording. "Don't send me your social security number," she said dryly. "Just the clinical bits. We can work from there." She sounded tired, but engaged, like a person who had argued for people with no voice long enough to understand how often the system made that hard. When the files came, Avery's reply came back with a single efficient note. "This is enough to bring a temporary emergency petition for protective custody of the patient's decision-making. We can ask the court to appoint a neutral guardian ad litem, someone whose job is to represent Evelyn's interests alone. But it's urgent and messy, Matt. We need chain of custody for that audio, and we need it secured." Chain of custody. The term felt sterile and enormous at once, the legal equivalent of a seatbelt, a way to keep evidence intact so it would be taken seriously. He'd read about it in med-legal textbooks, but had never had to think about it for a patient he cared for. Matthew placed the physical recorder into a sealed hospital envelope and signed across the flap with his initials and the date. He took careful photographs of the recorder in the envelope, the seal intact, and uploaded the digital audio to a secure hospital server with a visible timestamp. He logged the transfer in the unit's incident reporting system and sent an encrypted note to Harriet and risk management to let her know there was a potential issue they needed to investigate. Harriet's reply was slow and measured, like all compliance officers who had to keep a foot in the institution and another outside it. She asked for a formal incident report, for the chain of custody log, and for Matthew to refrain from talking about the evidence beyond the necessary team. She also scheduled a risk meeting the next morning to discuss whether patient transfers should be held. The hospital's legal counsel, a bland voice with a careful manner, joined on the call and asked to see the files. The hospital was a machine that preferred restraint. Its instincts were to protect itself and to maintain process. Those instincts could, at times, clash with an individual's need for rescue. Matthew knew that. He knew, too, that changing a machine required both a wrench and a soft hand, legal maneuvering and moral clarity. That night, he stayed late. The city was a ribbon of lights beyond the window. He sat in the leather chair, a mug of chamomile steaming beside him, and paged through a photo album on the bedside table. Evelyn's life unfolded in stills. A younger woman laughing at a charity gala, her arm around a small child wearing a Captain America t-shirt. A photograph of her standing at a farm, muddy boots on, looking like someone who had spent a decade with her sleeves rolled up. A clipping of an article praising her for establishing scholarships at the local school. It was easier to see the person in photographs than in charts. He thought of his grandmother. He thought of promises he'd made in quieter, earlier years to the patients whose hands he had held. He has never wanted to be the kind of doctor who let a life be reduced to a signature. In the morning, the meeting room smelled of coffee and the lemon antiseptic used on conference tables. Harriet sat at the head of the table. Dr. Langston, a stoic senior physician whose name showed up on several of the consult notes, was there and looked older than his badge photo. Catherine and Damien had sent their counsel,
polished, quiet women who preferred layers to conversations. Matthew sat opposite them, with Leela beside him, the recorder now cataloged in an evidence packet. Avery arrived a minute late, carrying a folder that looked like it knew how to stand its ground. The room felt like a court before anything was spoken. Legal counsel emphasized process. Harriet emphasized caution. Catherine's representative kept the family framed as protective of privacy, the arguments dressed in concern over the stress of litigation. Damien's voice was an undercurrent in emails, impatient, defensive. There was a palpable sense that this could be handled quietly, that a gentle transfer to palliative care preserved dignity and avoided spectacle. Matthew pushed. He called attention to the timeline. Therapy canceled after a private meeting. Meds adjusted with inconsistent times. A proxy presented after a change in Evelyn cognitive status. The scanned "don't save me" that did not match earlier advance directives. He did not accuse. He asked questions that drew attention to process. At one point, Dr. Langston spoke in a tone that was meant to reassure. "We have to respect the overall clinical gestalt," he said, using a term clinicians use to describe the intuitive sum of observations. Sometimes comfort-focused care is the ethical choice. Avery's hand lifted, tamping down the rhetorical flourish.
"The challenge here," she said, "is whether the gestalt is current and whether the patient's expressed will, her agency, has been secured without undue influence." She explained briefly, for those in the room who were not lawyers, what a guardian ad litem did, a neutral advocate appointed by a court to speak exclusively for the patient's interests. She spoke of emergency petitions that could ask a judge to temporarily freeze transfers or changes in decision-making until a proper assessment occurred. She spoke without melodrama, but not without force. Catherine's eyes flashed. "We just want what is best for Evelyn," she said. "We are a family. We have consulted every specialist." "And the paperwork reflects that," Matthew answered, gesturing to the stack of console pages that bore 18 clinician signatures and their ordering recommendations. But signatures on a form are not the same as a current bedside neurological assessment. I am asking for time to verify what the bedside is actually showing. Harriet nodded. "We will place a temporary hold on any transfers until an internal review is satisfactory. We are not preventing care. We are preventing movement that might complicate an investigation." The hold was a small administrative lever with a large moral implication. To the hospital, it would read as prudence. To the family, it could read as an affront. To Evelyn, it might mean nothing at all, or it might mean a reassertion of agency. To Matthew, it felt like a thin protective membrane he had fashioned around the patient, and he feared its fragility. Outside the meeting, an aide was found to have left a patient file in a corridor. It was benign, but it tasted like negligence. Matthew walked back past the door of Evelyn's room and saw Leela standing with the thermos, like a sentinel. She had refused to sign away her conscience when the hospital buzz told her to back off. "You did the right thing," he said simply. He was learning that in bureaucracies, simple moral clarity sometimes needed to be said aloud because systems could not feel it. They began formalizing evidence. Avery instructed Matthew on the language prosecutors would gravitate toward and the phrases judges liked in emergency petitions. Again, not procedural instruction, but rhetoric tuned to mercy. She then turned and asked him softly, "Tell me who Evelyn was." He told her about the photographs. He told her about the scholarship funds and the small farm she kept in the country, about an obituary notice he had read for a man who'd been her husband a few years earlier. Avery listened, and in the pauses she recorded the human outline that the paperwork was otherwise smudging. Outside the legal and clinical maneuvers, the hospital whispered with its own politics. Nurses clustered at stations and spoke in low tones, eyes on one another, sizing what it meant to cross a line. Some whispered support for Matthew. Some warned him about career costs.
The machine the hospital represented could be both savior and obstacle, and those who worked inside it often had to pick a side or live with the indecision forever. A short vignette. Leela had once cared for an elderly man whose daughter had insisted on private care for reasons of inheritance shuffling. He died months later with a smile and not a complaint, Leela told Matthew. The family had gone their separate ways, not under public scandal, but under private sighs. That memory haunted her and helped her choose to keep the recorder. Another vignette. Avery had once lost a case where the court had found that the evidence did not meet the threshold needed to appoint a guardian. It had been years earlier, and she'd carried that loss like a stone in her pocket. It was one of the reasons she did not litigate casually. It was also why she took urgent petitions seriously. "We are not gladiators," she told Matthew. "We are caretakers of process." Their next steps were deliberate. Avery drafted a petition that would ask the court to temporarily suspend any transfer of Evelyn's decision-making authority and to appoint a neutral guardian to arrange for an independent neurological assessment. It would not be dramatic, legally speaking. It would be surgical and narrow. But in practice, it would interrupt the momentum that had been carrying Evelyn toward a quiet withdrawal of interventions. Matthew compiled an evidence folder for Avery: photocopies of consults, the sealed recorder note, medication logs, copies of the proxy and trust documents, a typed timeline of events with names and times. He also wrote a short, plain statement about what he'd seen at the bedside. Small but persistent signs of response inconsistent with the degree of withdrawal the file claimed. He tried to be clinical. He refused to let his sentences be overwrought. The patient deserved that. Catherine's counsel, when advised of the petition, reserved the family's right to contest. Damien arrived at the hospital one afternoon, hair crooked, face flushed. "You're going to ruin everything," he said to Matthew in the corridor, more in fear than in anger. "We didn't call you to be an adversary." Matthew did not take it personally. "I'm not trying to ruin your family," he said. "I'm trying to make sure what happens to your mother is actually what she wants, and not something done by accident or design." His words did not satisfy Damien, but they did register in the air. In the days that followed, the hospital's internal review unfolded like a slow-moving clockwork. Nurses were interviewed, aides submitted statements, medication dispensation reels were audited. A notary who had been present at the signing of the proxy answered questions. His handwriting analysis did not scream forgery, but it did raise questions about the circumstances under which the proxy was signed. There were no dramatic confessions, no easy admissions, just a lot of small, worrisome gaps.
Then came the morning Matthew had anticipated and feared in equal measure. A man from the trustee office called to ask, politely, when the hospital would release Evelyn for transfer to a private facility where, the trustee said, she would receive discreet, comfortable care. The trustee's office had been in contact with the family for months. The offer sounded harmless when said over the phone. It sounded like a luxury care arrangement. It also sounded, to Matthew, like an exit strategy that would place Evelyn outside of scrutiny. He documented the call. He notified Avery. The petition that Avery crafted asked, in precise legal language, that any transfers be frozen and that an independent neurologist perform an assessment with court oversight. It was a straightforward ask, a single temporary restraint to preserve the patient's options until the truth could be established. The filing was not a coup. The filing was a request for time. Matthew arranged the evidence to be picked up and logged with hospital security. Leela watched as the envelope was carried out of the unit, fingers worrying the edge of her scrub sleeve. The sense of something irreversible about to take place pulled at them all. For Matthew, it felt like leaning over a ledge and choosing to jump into uncertainty for the sake of another person. Word spread, as where it does. Some staff praised him in hushed tones, others avoided him in the hallways. Competing narratives formed. Some said he was a hero, others whispered that he had overstepped, that he had invited litigation into the sanctity of a family's grieving. These were the margins that people live on, the place where ethics is practiced and second-guessed. That afternoon, Dr. Mendez, a neurologist known for careful assessments and a reluctance to make dramatic statements without evidence, agreed to be available for an independent consult should the court appoint her. The idea of a neutral, independent neurologist, someone whose sole task was to report neurological findings and not the family's wishes, was, to Matthew, a way to translate bedside signs into language the court could respect. The pieces were falling into place, recordings sealed and logged, consults counted and questioned, legal filings drafted, the hospital placing a temporary administrative hold. But the story had not yet turned. The machine of law moves slowly. Courts require time and proof. Family lawyers prepared to fight, trustees prepared to argue for privacy, and in the middle of it, Evelyn slept, an unread paperback on her lap and the scent of chamomile soft as a benediction. Late into the evening, Matthew sat in the corridor and watched the city blur past the glass, a wash of motion against the static of the suite. Avery had called to say she would file the petition that night, asking the court to issue an emergency temporary order. She spoke with that rare mix of legal cadence and human empathy that suggested she had chosen this work for reasons beyond money. "If the judge grants us an ex parte order," she said, "we can get a temporary guardian appointed to keep the status quo until a hearing. Ex parte means we present our evidence without the other side there, but it also means we have to show immediate and irreparable harm if we don't act now." Matthew felt the weight of the word, irreparable. It was heavy and ethical and frankly terrifying.
It was also the only language that could possibly make the system pause long enough for truth to be heard. He thought again of the 18 signatures. They were not villains. Many were clinicians who, at one time or another, had made calls based on partial information. But when signatures collected like that, when a group consensus forms in a vacuum of current observation, agency can be washed away under the paperwork's tide. His act would not arrest the tide. It would only toss a wedge in the flow to see whether the water ran clear. Avery filed. The petition went to the pro tem judge who handled emergency matters. The hospital received notice. Catherine's counsel prepared to respond. Damien paced the family office like a man measuring time in steps. Leela sat in the locker room, the thermos cooling in her hands, her palms raw from worry. And somewhere, in the stack of evidence, in a sealed envelope with Matthew's initials scrawled across the edge, the small recorder waited quietly, like a witness in the dark. The call from the clerk came at midnight. A judge had read the petition and wanted more. An affidavit from Matthew detailing bedside observations and a certification that the audio and chain of custody had been secured. The judge's eyes, Matthew imagined, were brisk and unromantic, the sort of eyes that do not like uncertainty but will tolerate it when convinced. He drafted his affidavit at his kitchen table, late-night paper rustling and the city a distant murmur. He wrote plainly what he'd seen, the specific times, the discrete signs of responsiveness. He outlined the discrepancies in the records and the sequences that had raised concern. He did not editorialize. He told the truth as he had seen it. This was the hinge. The petition could be accepted or denied. The hospital could lock the door or hand it back to the family. The trustee could escalate. The legal machinery took a breath. Before dawn, a court clerk confirmed receipt of the affidavit and said the judge would consider the ex parte request first thing in the morning. These get priority, the clerk said, but judges are cautious. Matthew walked slowly back to the suite. The city was stirring, and the hospital had the soft, washed-out light of people who worked through the hours when others slept. Evelyn's hand had moved during the night. The fingertip had brushed the corner of her book, leaving a faint crease. It was the kind of small, human thing that mattered. He sat down on the edge of the bed, careful of monitors and wires, and placed his hand near hers, close enough to be present, distant enough not to startle. She breathed, a small, ordinary sound. The room, which had been restructured into a place of strategy and evidence, became, for an instant, simply a place where a human being rested. There would be a hearing. There would be cross-examination of statements, depositions from nurses and aides, and perhaps a battle over the meaning of signatures and notation. There would be, if they were fortunate, an independent neurological assessment that could translate bedside signs into a language courts understood. But for now, the machine had been nudged. A single doctor had refused to accept a descending consensus. He had read 3 words that didn't sit right and had chosen to act. That act was messy and would produce consequences both intended and unforeseen. It was also an ordinary kind of courage, the kind that starts with seeing someone as more than a paper. Outside, the city began to open its eyes. Inside, in a hospital suite that smelled faintly of chamomile and antiseptic, the pieces of a complicated story had been put into motion. The petition would be heard. The recording would be examined. The signatures that read like an avalanche would be taken apart, one by one, to see whether they had been placed with full knowledge and with the patient's true will at heart. Matthew left the bedside for a moment and walked the corridor, pausing at the nurse's station where small things registered, an access badge blinking, a sticky note with a patient's favorite song, a photo of a dog taped to a locker. In the world of patient care, the little things were often the only things that betrayed truth. As morning light began to push through the windows, a clerk brought a paper folder up to the unit. The ex parte petition had been filed. The judge would rule on whether to temporarily appoint a guardian and order an independent neurological assessment. The clerk's eyes were polite but unreadable. Matthew felt his pulse in his wrists. He returned to Evelyn's room and found Leela arranging the chamomile thermos on the bedside table. "Whatever happens," she whispered, "I just want her to be seen." Matthew took a breath, and the hospital, which had been a place of routine decisions made by signatures, turned toward a small possibility that one person could slow a system long enough for a truth to surface. The consequences would ripple outward. Some would welcome those ripples, some would resent them. Evelyn, for the first time in weeks, shifted her hand and closed her paperback, the small hinge of a finger signaling, as quietly as a bell, that the story was far from over.
They waited for a phone call that meant the world to them in a way that must have felt absurd to everyone else. An ordinary piece of paper signed by a judge, granting a very specific pause.
It would not fix everything. It would only buy them space. And sometimes, space was all you needed to let a fragile thing find its voice. The judge's written order arrived like a small decisive thing, a single sheet stamped with a seal and a line of type that, to the people in the unit, meant the world. Temporary guardian ad litem appointed, all transfers and non-emergent changes to decision-making authorities stayed pending further hearing. Independent neurological assessment authorized. It was neither a victory nor a verdict. It was a pause. It was permission to look more closely. On the morning the court's clerk called to confirm, there was a quiet celebration that was practical rather than triumphant. Leela, who'd spent the night replaying fragments of the recorder in her head, grinned with relief and a touch of disbelief. Avery, composed and efficient, suggested a plan for the next steps, scheduling Dr. Mendez for the assessment, assembling deposition timelines, preparing witness affidavits, and setting up a protocol to maintain the chain of custody integrity for all evidence going into court. Matthew took the order back to Evelyn's room and read the single line aloud to Leela, no fanfare, because the kind of breath it took to say the sentence out loud felt like a private thing shared among conspirators. Evelyn's fan lay loosely on the blanket. The paperback still sat folded at her hip like a bookmark of who she used to be. Now, more eyes would look at that hand and at the page. The record would be cleared of the dust that paperwork had gathered. There was, of course, resistance. Catherine's counsel filed a motion to quash certain aspects of the petition, arguing that family privacy and the patient's best interests could be compromised by litigation and public scrutiny. Damien's text to the hospital administration grew terse and then clipped, an attempt to marshal reputational concerns into pressure. The trustee's office hired a specialist to argue that the transfer to the private facility was in the patient's comfort interest and that court intervention would produce unnecessary stress. Avery answered with the kind of legal restraint that had the ring of a practiced musician. She would not inflame the room with rhetoric. She would offer evidence and ask the court to make space for independent assessment. She filed a narrow set of requests designed to avoid headline-grabbing accusations and instead focus the judge's attention on facts: the timing of the proxy, the inconsistencies in therapy notes, the audio that suggested conversations about financial timing, and the unambiguous holes in the medication administration records. The legal strategy privileged credibility and patience over theatrics. On a cold spring morning, Dr. Sophia Mendez arrived at the hospital. She moved with the calm exactness of someone who'd learned to let nervous family members be loud while she considered what the patient would actually show.
In the conference room, she and Matthew reviewed Evelyn's history. Prior strokes, baseline cognitive testing years earlier, notes about sleep-wake cycles, and the stack of consults that had been the origin of the 18 signatures count. Mendez wanted to meet Evelyn with no preconceptions. When she entered the private suite, the room seemed to yield to her habitual focus. She observed Evelyn as a clinician first, and then as a person. Eyes, pupils, breathing pattern, spontaneous breath, the way fingers flexed and relaxed. Dr. Mendez performed a series of careful bedside tests, motor responses, tracking with light and sound, reflexes, and a series of commands she returned to at intervals to look for consistency. She noted the small things most likely to be missed in an administrative cascade: a delayed but purposeful squeeze, a slight turn of the head in response to a patient's name, the way Evelyn's lips formed as if to sound, but without full phonation. In a short preliminary report to the court, Dr. Mendez described inconsistent but present, purposeful responses. She avoided grand labels. She emphasized variability, the sort of thing that made a difference in deciding whether comfort-only measures were appropriate that day, or whether further evaluation and supportive interventions could allow a patient to regain more agency. The wording mattered. The judge's clerk read it and took notes, as if this was the hinge the judge would weigh. The first formal hearing took place in the courthouse's small hearing room, where afternoon light cut across a wooden bench and a bailiff's shoes tapped in even rhythm. The room smelled faintly of old paper and typed affidavits. Avery opened by reading a succinct chronology into the record: the timing of therapy cancellations, the times medication logs showed unexpected gaps, the sudden appearance of the proxy document, and the recording Leela had provided.
She described chain of custody protocols they had used, sealed envelopes, hospital log stamps, and secure server uploads, and asked that the court treat the recorded evidence as admissible for the limited purpose of determining whether a neutral guardian should be appointed and whether an independent assessment should be authorized. Catherine's counsel objected to the admission of the recording on grounds of hearsay and potential tampering. The trustee's legal representative argued for deference to family autonomy and requested the court to consider the existing plan for transfer. The judge listened with an impartial focus, more interested in thresholds than in drama. He asked questions that were small and precise. Had the audio been tampered with? Was there an independent witness to its procurement? Had a medical professional contemporaneously documented the patient's responsiveness? Each question sought to translate a chaotic bedside into courtroom language. Leela took the stand first, her uniform neatly pressed despite the long hours.
She was asked to describe the night she'd heard the aide's offhand talk and how she had come to take custody of the recorder. Her hands were steady as she recounted the moments between shifts. The feeling that something about the aide's tone had been wrong, the awkwardness of finding the recorder on a linen shelf, the fear of breaching policy balanced against the fear of leaving a voice unheard. She described placing the device into a sealed hospital envelope, photographing it and logging it with security. She answered cross-examination with quiet clarity. When Catherine's counsel suggested she had made an unauthorized recording, Leela replied, "I didn't record. I preserved. I didn't want to be the person who ignored a voice." A nursing aide, young, apologetic, and visibly uncomfortable, testified next. Under questioning, she explained how she had come back from Evelyn's room and heard a brief exchange between Damien and a caregiver, tones that to her felt like instructions more about timing than care, and how she had later noticed the recorder. She admitted to being nervous about testifying. She was also relieved that the ward had taken her concerns seriously enough to keep her job and to protect her from retaliation. Then came the playback. The audio was not cinematic in the way television made such moments. It was an honest, uneven file with shuffles, a cough, and a voice that sounded impatient and small next to the hum of an air handler. The judge asked the court reporter to mark the exhibit, and the room collectively leaned forward. The clip played through once, then again. When it finished, there was a soft sound. Breathing in the room, the rustle of paper. The recording did not prove ill intent with a flourish, but the tone and the timing, coupled with the other irregularities, were enough to cement the judge's inclination to act. Dr. Langston, called as an expert witness for the hospital, read his interpretation of the collected consults and spoke to the gestalt of a patient whose prior course suggested palliative direction. He had signed several consult notes and was careful in his speech. But under questioning, he conceded that many of his sign-offs had been based on summaries rather than fresh bedside reassessments, and that the consult cascade often relied on prior notations rather than repeated hands-on tests. It was an admission that carried weight in a hearing that was less about blame than about whether the system had allowed an individual patient to be passed along without a fresh, independent check. The judge considered the evidence. He was not inclined to issue sweeping decrees, but in his written bench note he cited the need for independent verification of neurological status and confirmation that decision-making authority accurately reflects the patient's wishes, and he authorized Dr. Mendez to perform a formal assessment with court oversight.
He also ordered the trustee's office to preserve any records related to the proxy and to refrain from transferring the patient to the private facility until further court order. It was exactly the small surgical intrusion Avery had argued for, a pause with teeth, one that would hold the status quo while the facts were inspected. Following the hearing, the hospital announced an administrative leave for Dr. Langston, pending the internal review. It was a move designed to show both deference to due process and an institutional willingness to allow independent inquiries to proceed without perceptions of interference. The staff reaction was mixed. Some thought it too harsh, others saw it as the only way for a system to change. Matthew, for his part, felt neither triumphant nor vindicated. The legal pause had bought space, and that space would need to be turned into careful, humane work. Dr. Mendez's formal neurobehavioral assessment in the days that followed was methodical. She used standardized instruments that measured responsiveness, command following, and attention spans. The results were characterized in a report that emphasized variability. At times, Evelyn showed purposeful orientation to her name. At other times, she lay with minimal response.
Importantly, Dr. Mendez noted that certain simple external stimuli, familiar music, the scent of chamomile tea, the feel of a paperback page, produced observable changes in Evelyn's behavior. The report cautioned against immediate comfort-only decisions and recommended a time-limited trial of targeted rehabilitative efforts with ongoing reassessment. The language mattered for the court because it translated bedside nuances into medical terms judges could accept. Inconsistent but present command following, variability likely influenced by sleep-wake cycle and medication, and recommendation for a trial period of rehabilitative support. The judge approved a 90-day protective period in which the neutral guardian would coordinate ongoing assessments, and he asked the parties to file status updates at regular intervals. That protective period was the moment when the story shifted from emergency to process. It meant a flurry of new activity that had to be both clinical and human. Consultations with physical and occupational therapists, careful review of medications that might have been sedating, nutrition assessments, and a court-ordered meeting with a guardian ad litem who would prioritize Evelyn's preferences above family or institutional convenience. It also meant an inquiry into trustee practices. The trustee's office pledged full cooperation with any audit. The trustee himself was placed on administrative hold pending review of document handling and disclosure practices. For the frontline team, the 90-day plan felt like a permission slip to do the work they had, in many cases, been meaning to do for longer. Nurses resumed regular therapy notes.
Therapists charted a baseline for mobility and communication. A speech-language pathologist introduced simple exercises, reintroducing Evelyn to her own name, using pictures from her life to prompt recognition, playing recordings of family voices who had been cleared for therapy sessions that were not entangled in financial discussions. One morning in the therapy bay, a simple, human victory occurred. Matthew stood at the foot of a parallel bars frame as Evelyn, flanked by a therapist who held a gait belt, took 2 small, staggering steps toward a chair. It wasn't a march back to health or a cinematic recovery. It was a person asserting a moment of balance and control. She sat, breathless but steady, and smiled in a way that suggested something inside had been reached, however slowly, by this piece of the work. The room erupted in the kind of quiet, contained applause hospitals have for small wins. Recovery, when it came, was composed of many such small, stubborn things. A left hand finding a mug handle and lifting, a lip forming the sound of a name, a laugh that started as a breath and then became a genuine chuckle. Where paperwork had suggested a flat line of wishes, the bedside revealed texture. Therapists kept careful notes, not to create a counter-narrative to family concerns, but to document what patient-centered care now required: time, stimulation, and protection from hasty determinations. Meanwhile, the legal processes that had been set in motion continued to unfurl. Depositions were taken from aides and staff, testimony was transcribed, and the trustees' internal practices were examined by an independent auditor the court had authorized to avoid conflict of interest. The notary who had witnessed the proxy signing was asked to provide a statement about the circumstances in which the document had been notarized. He could not recall the precise atmosphere, only that the signing had been conducted in a trust office lunchroom and that the signer had seemed rushed. That lack of clarity was not a smoking gun, but it contributed to a pattern of concern. Investigations into potential undue influence are rarely dramatic. They unfold like careful unpeeling, asking who stood to benefit, who had access to the patient, who had the repeated opportunity to shape decisions. The auditors found that trustees had had unusual access to bedside information, that certain signatures appeared on consult sheets without contemporaneous bedside notes, and that some proxy documentation had been notarized under circumstances that merited further review. The auditors recommended a fuller probe into trustee practices and a policy review at the hospital. The hospital's board, in response to public whispers and the court's scrutiny, convened a special committee to propose reforms. Harriet led the internal review with a pragmatic determination.
Her notes were precise. Strengthen verification for advance directives. Require periodic bedside reassessments when decisions might move a patient to comfort-only pathways. Create protections for staff who raise concerns, and develop a secure, anonymous reporting channel for suspected undue influence. She also recommended a technical change. The electronic medical record should flag when a cluster of consult signatures is not accompanied by bedside reevaluations in the preceding 48 hours. Matthew, who had worried that his act might have only produced friction, found himself unexpectedly participating in policy meetings. He showed the board the chart that had started everything, the laminated scan, the stack of signatures, the cheap paperback that had somehow been left open like an accusation. He spoke gently about the difference between paperwork and presence. He did not demand scapegoats. He asked the institution to commit to structures that honor the dignity of individual patients and protect it against the subtle erosion of agency. Leela, for her courage in preserving the evidence, was quietly acknowledged by the staff. There was no parade, hospital bureaucracy does not march to that beat, but a framed commendation at the nurses' station and an offer for advanced training in clinical advocacy. The ward arranged a brief ceremony in which staff could express appreciation for speaking up. It felt private and necessary. The trustees' relationships with the family became strained. Damien, who had once been the figure of impatient calculation, found himself counseled by lawyers and waitlisted for depositions. He still visited, but his visits were more awkward, less perfunctory. At one point, he asked to speak with Matthew alone in the corridor. There, in quiet tones, he said, "I thought we were doing what she wanted." Matthew did not reply with triumph or accusation. He said, "Maybe so, maybe not. There is a difference between what we think someone wants and what we can prove they wanted at that time. The work isn't about punishment. It's about ensuring her voice is really hers." Damien's face tightened. "You know how complicated it is," he said. "We have obligations, trusts, boards. We do things that look odd to some people, but are necessary to keep institutions solvent." "There's a way to keep institutions running without overriding a person's autonomy," Matthew said. "You can honor obligations and protect a human being. They aren't mutually exclusive." Those were the conversations that did more than any courtroom exchange to change the tone of what followed. They were the slow, human re-education of people who had learned to equate efficiency with good care. It takes time to relearn that the ultimate metric is the person's lived wishes. As Evelyn gained clarity, the court allowed a limited series of family meetings mediated by the guardian ad litem. These sessions had rules. No discussions of trust transfers while Evelyn was being assessed, no private meetings without counsel, and a neutral third party present to ensure that Evelyn's consent was informed. At first, the meetings were awkward and curt. Catherine insisted on framing her views in the context of decades of family decisions. Damien remained defensive. But once Evelyn began to show a clearer capacity to express simple preferences, her fondness for the farm, her aversion to certain foods, her desire to speak with an old friend, the tone softened. People began to remember that the person at the center of the dispute had more history than any ledger. In one particularly moving session, Evelyn reached across a table and, in a small, deliberate movement, placed a photograph in front of Catherine, a photograph of the two of them at a fundraiser years before, both younger, both smiling. She tapped the photo, turned it toward Catherine, and, with a clarity that surprised everyone, said a single word: "Together." It was not a legal declaration of pardon or reconciliation. It was a human reach that realigned the language in the room from rights or trusts to relationships. It did not erase concerns about undue influence or irregular trustee practices. It did not mean the family's defense evaporated, but it demonstrated what so many of the clinicians had quietly argued for all along, that decisions had to be anchored to a person, not a policy. Within 6 weeks, the courtroom drama had given way to an array of quieter administrative actions. The trustee agreed to suspend certain unilateral decisions while cooperating with the audit. The hospital implemented a new verification policy for advance directives and signed an agreement to institute mandatory bedside reassessment when a cluster of consults recommended comfort-focused care. Training modules were drafted to teach clinicians the signs of undue influence and the ethical imperative of verifying agency. Meanwhile, Evelyn's recovery continued in halting but meaningful ways. In occupational therapy, she relearned fine motor tasks, using a stylus to press keys on a tablet to call her preferred songs. In speech therapy, she worked on breath support and the enunciation of short phrases. One day, she found a post-it note in her therapy notebook, written in Matthew's tidy hand. "Take your time. Your voice is yours." She smiled and slotted that note into the small paperback she brought from home. The formation of the foundation emerged from a conversation that began at bedside and continued in Avery's office over tomato soup and a shared sandwich. Evelyn, with a strength of purpose that had once led her to establish scholarships, decided she wanted to prevent others from being placed in situations like the one she had endured. She wanted a public instrument that could fund legal advocacy for vulnerable patients, support family mediation services, and teach hospitals how to strengthen protections against undue influence. They chose a name that was emblematic rather than self-congratulatory, a Center for Patient Advocacy and Elder Rights that would provide legal clinics, hospital training programs, and a public awareness campaign. The Foundation's mission statement, crafted in meetings that involved lawyers, ethicists, family members, and frontline staff, was concise: to protect the right of vulnerable adults to have their preferences honored, to support clinicians who raise concerns, and to educate institutions about power dynamics that can influence care. The hospital agreed to partner with the fledgling foundation, offering meeting space and a small grant as part of its commitment to reform. The partnership allowed the foundation to lease an office near the hospital, a place where caregivers could meet with legal counsel and where families could seek mediation without the glare of headlines. Avery became the foundation's first legal director, a role she accepted with characteristic ambivalence. She liked the idea of institutional reform more than public praise. The trustees' audit, which stretched over months, resulted not in criminal charges but in administrative censure and new reporting requirements for trustee practices. The auditors recommended bans on certain types of unsupervised access and suggested that trustees be required to demonstrate documentation of their consultative involvement, independent of family statements. These were policy outcomes that would not close the matter with the dramatic finality of a conviction, but they were the sort of incremental structural changes that could prevent similar patterns from arising again. Through this period, Matthew and Evelyn's connection evolved in a manner that was careful and ethically attuned. At first, their relationship was entirely professional, a physician advocating for a patient regaining agency. As Evelyn's cognition became more consistent and she was formally discharged from Matthew's direct care, an important legal and ethical boundary, there was room for a different kind of human closeness to emerge. They met outside the hospital in a public, unpressured way, a coffee in a crowded cafe, a walk in a botanical garden where Evelyn's laughter came easily when she spotted a child chasing bubbles. They made decisions deliberately. They discussed the ethics of becoming more than doctor and patient. They sought counsel from bioethicists and legal advisors to ensure that no impropriety would ever be alleged, and they allowed time to pass. Evelyn insisted upon independence in every step. Her voice, once at risk of being overwritten, demanded the right to choose her company. She returned to the farm for weekends to test her stamina.
She re-established trusteeship arrangements with new, court-approved oversight, and she wrote a short, carefully worded letter that reorganized her estate planning in a way that reflected clarity and the input of counsel she trusted. When they decided to move forward with a relationship beyond friendship, they did it with transparency. Matthew formally removed himself from any professional responsibilities related to Evelyn's care. The hospital recorded the change, and both sought therapy and counsel to ensure the relationship began on solid, ethical ground. Their first dinner as something more than friends took place at a simple table with few witnesses. Evelyn brought a small paperback book as a gift, the same kind of paperback she'd kept by her bed, and she wrote a note on the inside cover, "For keeping my place." The public unveiling of the foundation, an afternoon ceremony to cut a ribbon and open a modest office near the hospital, was both personal and institutional. Evelyn, with a scarf around her neck and a glass of tea in hand, spoke briefly about the importance of voice and of the need for systems that listen. She thanked the quiet people who had done loud things only when they had to: Leela, the aides, the therapists, naming them not as heroes to be lionized, but as citizens who had done what was right. The hospital used the event to announce a set of reforms: mandatory bedside reassessments in certain cases, staff protections for reporting concerns, an internal audit mechanism to review patterns of proxy documents and trustee access, and a partnership agreement with the foundation to fund training. Harriet stood alongside the hospital president as they signed the first memorandum. The memorandum was bureaucratic in language but meaningful in consequence. It created structures through which patient voices had to be verified and protected. In the months that followed, the city paper ran a feature on the case, careful in tone and attentive to nuance. Some critics argued the changes were reactive and the hospital should have done more sooner. Others praised the reforms as meaningful attempts to repair oversight gaps. The story did not convert everyone overnight, but it moved public conversation about elder care and undue influence into new spaces: boardrooms, nursing conferences, and, importantly, family living rooms where adults began to ask one another more clearly about wishes and proxies. Evelyn's foundation hosted its first clinic,
a pro bono legal day for families concerned about guardianship and undue influence. People arrived with taped phone recordings, messy stacks of hospital notes, and the kind of nervous hope that indicates both desperation and possibility. Avery and a team of volunteer lawyers sat with families and helped them understand their options.
For some, the clinic was the beginning of a legal intervention. For many, it was the first time they'd been listened to in a way that centered the vulnerable person rather than the institution. Leela returned to the ward and taught a short seminar about nurse advocacy, how to keep good notes, when to escalate, and the ethical basis for preserving evidence. She still kept her thermos of chamomile nearby. Sometimes she would hand a cup to a family member who looked exhausted and say nothing more than, "Stay, sit." Her voice recorder stayed locked in the hospital evidence vault as a symbol of the moment when a small, ordinary object changed the arc of a life. There were, inevitably, consequences for Matthew. He endured whispers, a slow erosion of some collegial warmth, and a few procedural reviews as the hospital reconciled internal policy with the realities of advocacy. But he also received newfound respect from many who had once been cautious. He was invited to speak at a medical ethics conference about the responsibilities clinicians carry when paperwork supplants peasants. He used the platform to be careful rather than sensational, to argue not for heroes, but for systems that make heroism unnecessary. Evelyn's recovery was not an arrow, but a curve. She never returned to the same levels of independence she had decades before, and she never wanted to be cheered for every small gain as if that made up for lost time. Her days were measured by pleasures reclaimed, visits to the farm where she once planted seeds, a renewed habit of reading short stories rather than long novels, and the satisfaction of chairing a foundation board that now funded legal clinics across the region. The foundation's early successes were modest but steady. A handful of guardianship challenges resolved with new oversight, training modules at other bi-regional hospitals, and a small endowment that funded local advocacy for a year. It did not change the world overnight, but it changed the way a hospital in one city approached its most fragile patients. On the second anniversary of the court's initial order, the hospital held a quiet ceremony to mark the adoption of its new policies. The chief medical officer read a prepared statement that acknowledged institutional blind spots and committed to ongoing training and audits. Dr. Langston, who had been placed on leave, had by then retired. His departure was handled quietly, leaving room in the public narrative for institutional learning rather than personal condemnation. The staff presented Leela with a small plaque that read simply, "For the courage to listen." At the ribbon cutting for the foundation, Matthew and Evelyn stood side by side. She wore a scarf the color of chamomile, and he held a copy of the foundation's mission in his hand. Cameras clicked politely. The speech that mattered came after the public remarks, when Evelyn turned to the group and said softly, "Get people's names right. Put books in their hands.
Let them make small choices." It was a line that refused grandiosity and instead insisted on minute dignity. Those who worked in patient care understood the profundity. Small choices accumulate into a life. The case left questions unresolved and lessons that would have to be paid for over years. Trustees changed how they worked. Lawyers adjusted pro forma practices for notarizations and access. Hospitals across the region debated the balance between family privacy and protective oversight. The reforms were not panaceas, and stubborn cases would continue to appear. But the system had, in one place, learned to look. It had learned to favor bedside verification over a consensus of signatures. Years later, in an op-ed written for the hospital's alumni magazine, Avery reflected on what had changed. She wrote not as a litigator triumphalist, but as someone who had watched the slow work of law make room for human complexity. "Systems can be improved," she wrote, "when ordinary people insist that the paperwork be tested against presence. That may be the capacity we most need. Policy grounded in the simple truth that a human being is not a file." In a quieter epilogue, Matthew returned to visit Evelyn at her country home. Sunlight warmed the porch, where a cup of chamomile steamed and a paperback lay open on a table. They spoke about small things, books, the farm, an old recipe Evelyn intended to revive. They spoke about the Foundation's new outreach programs and the next training module Harriet had proposed. There were long silences that were comfortable rather than empty. He thought sometimes about the stack of signatures that had looked like an avalanche. He thought of the way institutional momentum can feel like a flood when you stand in front of it, small and stubborn and wholly inadequate to the force it resists.
But he also thought about how a single voice, a nurse's instinct, a recorded moment, a lawyer's patience, could redirect water, not by heroics, but by the plumbing of careful, legal, and human action. On the porch that afternoon, Evelyn turned a page in her paperback and looked over to Matthew. "Thank you," she said, with a precision that had hard-earned clarity behind it. He shrugged in that modest way he had. "You did most of it," he said. "You held on." She smiled, closed the book, and set a finger between pages. "Keep my place," she said. They sat in the warmth, two people who had walked through a messy, necessary public battle and had arrived on the other side with new, mutual respect. The foundation sign down the lane read in plain letters, "Center for Patient Advocacy." Beneath it, in a smaller script, a line that evoked the story's modest core: "Small choices matter." If this story leaves one lesson, it is that systems do not reform without pressure, and that courage need not be ostentatious to be consequential.